Majorian was truly a gem in an age of ruin. In a world where emperors were little more than puppets and where the West seemed condemned to death, he stood out as the last great man of Rome. A soldier and a statesman who still believed that the empire of Augustus could be saved. Born in the final decades of the Western Empire from a minor noble family, Majorian rose through sheer talent. A brilliant commander, a pragmatic politician, a man of law, order, and discipline in the purest classical Roman style. Even though he lived in a society now fully Christianized, bound in the dogmas and superstitions that so often divided men later in our Western history, Majorian kept a broader vision. He valued the full heritage of Rome, both Christian and pagan, understanding that unity, not disunity, would save the empire. To him, Rome was not merely faith, but identity, a legacy to preserve, a culture to defend, a people to protect. And protect them he did. In only 5 short years of reign, Majorian reconquered Hispania, pacified Gaul, and restored Roman control where chaos had reigned for decades. His enemies feared him, his soldiers loved him, and even the Eastern court admired him. But sadly, greatness is rarely accompanied without jealousy. The shadow of Ricimer, the Germanic kingmaker, always loomed. And when Majorian prepared his greatest enterprise, a massive fleet in Hispania to retake North Africa from the Vandals, Ricimer struck. The fleet was sabotaged, destroyed by barbarian hands bribed into treachery. The dream of restoring North Africa, Rome's breadbasket, was lost before it began. Broken and betrayed, Majorian was recalled to Italy. There, Ricimer seized him, forced him to abdicate, and had him executed by 461. Rome's last great hope died at just 41 years old, and within a decade and a half after his tragic death, the Western Empire itself was gone, extinguished forever. But now, let's imagine a different path. What if Majorian had uncovered the plot? What if he had exposed Ricimer, preserved his fleet, and sailed for Africa? That's the alternate scenario we're going to explore today. So, as many of you might know, betrayals, corruption, and assassinations of emperors were all too common in Roman history, both in its brightest and darkest ages. And if betrayal was so common, then it is only logical to consider that, statistically, there was also a real chance for an emperor to discover the plot against him before it was carried out. It is under this logic that we begin our alternate scenario and the survival of Majorian. So, in this alternate timeline, while personally overseeing the construction of his vast new fleet in Hispania, Majorian and his closest generals would uncover troubling whispers. Remnants of the Visigoths or Suebi would be bribed into treachery, plotting to burn the ships before they are ever launched. This would not just be sabotage, it was the annihilation of Rome's last hope. But in this timeline, the conspirators would be caught, captured, tortured, and interrogated for days if necessary, until at last one of them breaks. And the truth then would emerge. The mastermind behind all of this would be none other than Ricimer himself, the Germanic regent, the so-called kingmaker of the West. Majorian would obviously be outraged. He would now know with certainty that his throne, his life, and the very future of Rome would be under mortal threat, and so he would act. Majorian would put a halt to his African project and would return swiftly to Italy. There, he would do what few emperors had dared for quite a while to do. He would strike at the root of corruption itself. Ricimer and his collaborators would be seized, condemned as traitors, and executed. What would follow is a purge in the pure, good old-based Roman style, brutal yes, but necessary. Cleansing the empire of internal rot, with Ricimer now gone, Majorian would finally govern as a true independent emperor. He would enforce his laws, strengthen his reforms against corruption, and restore order to Italy. Only then would he return to Hispania, probably early in 462, where his completed fleet would wait for him, ready for the reconquest of North Africa. In our timeline, even the Vandal king Genseric trembled at Majorian's name. His kingdom was unprepared, his defenses thin, and his people restless under his rule. In this alternate timeline, Majorian would descend upon North Africa with the discipline that characterized Rome in its golden age. The Vandals would be completely crushed, and then Carthage would be restored, and with it, the empire's fortunes would change overnight once again. Rome's breadbasket would return to their hands. Grain supply would once again flow into Italy, Hispania, and Gaul. Tax revenues would double in an instant. The hungry would be fed, the treasury would be refilled, and the morale of the Western Romans would have come back once again. But Majorian's greatest triumph would not only be military or economic, but also by honoring his promises. He would reward his veterans with land in North Africa, creating a loyalty rarely seen in those desperate times. His soldiers would see in him a man of virtue, of discipline, of Roman honor, and above all, a man of his word thanks to that action. Majorian would then become more than an emperor. He would become the new restorer of the world, and with North Africa secured, grain supply flowing, and a loyal army swelling with both veterans and new recruits, he would turn his eyes back to Europe. For on the northern frontier, the greatest challenge would still wait, the rising power and influence of the Franks. In Gaul, many Germanic tribes would have been pacified, some even settled as federates, yet one enemy would have remained too stubborn, too ambitious, and too dangerous to ignore, those being the Franks. Unlike other barbarians, the Franks were organized, they were disciplined, united by strong chieftains, and were pushing deeper into northern Gaul with every year. Majorian would know that if left unchecked, they could one day dominate all of Gaul. And so, with a veteran army behind him, and new recruits eager to fight for the restorer of the world, he would march north like Julius Caesar did once upon a time. The campaign would have been hard, very hard. The Franks were fierce, and their warriors would have fought with the determination of men defending their homeland, even if that land was not their homeland. Majorian, however, was relentless. He would not seek to annihilate them, for he understood well that such wars could drain Rome for decades. Instead, he sought to contain them, to draw the line of what was Roman and what was Frankish. After years of battle, maneuver, and attrition, Majorian achieved what no emperor of his time had managed, some degree of stability. A treaty would be forced upon the Franks, and the new border of the Western Empire would not be the Rhine, long lost to Rome. Majorian deep down would have understood that, but the Seine, everything south of that river would remain Roman, protected and secured, and everything north would be conceded to the Franks, who, for the time being, would remain stuck in the far northern frontiers. It was a compromise, sure, but a brilliant one due to the circumstances of his time. Simply put, the empire couldn't take the risk to compromise itself during decades of war like in the good old days, not anymore. Majorian sadly knew that only too well. The Seine would be a natural barrier, easier to defend than the distant Rhine, and it preserved the richest and most Romanized lands of Gaul, like Aquitaine, Burgundy, Provence, and the vital cities along the Mediterranean trade routes. To the Roman people, this would have been a victory. To the soldiers, it would be proof enough that their emperor could bring peace through strength, and to Majorian himself, it would be pragmatism in its purest Roman essence, for he knew that Rome's survival would not come from chasing lost dreams, at least not until they recovered from those dark times they had been suffering in the last centuries, but from defending what could still be held and making it flourish again eventually, with time, a lot of time. Now, with North Africa restored, Gaul stabilized, and the Franks contained beyond the Seine, the Western Empire finally stood on solid ground once again, yet Majorian would not have finished accomplishing all his goals. His eyes would now turn eastward, toward the Danube, where remnants of the Huns and restless Germanic tribes like the Gepides still prowled. This would also represent a great opportunity for the West and the East to work together against these common threats, and thus better intertwine relations between the two halves of the empire. The Huns had also been shattered at the Catalonian plains years earlier, yet fragments of their warbands still survived, wandering the plains of Pannonia and Thrace, striking like wolves whenever Rome's watch was weak, which was practically all the time in that era, but not anymore thanks to Majorian baseness. Alongside them, the Gepids and other Germanic tribes pressed the Danube frontier, seeking plunder, land, and weakness to exploit. To ignore them would have been to invite chaos into the Balkans, and Majorian would know that Rome could not afford another storm from the north. So he would act, but he would not act alone. For the first time in decades, the West and the East would coordinate their strength due to having a common threat. Legions from Italy and Gaul would march eastward, crossing the Alps and moving into the Danubian provinces, where they would fight side by side with the armies of Constantinople. Battles would rage along the river, Roman steel clashing against steppe horsemen and Germanic warriors, until together the two Romes pushed back the last remnants of Attila's heirs and forced the Gepids into total submission. This would not be only a military victory, but a political triumph. For the Eastern Emperor, who had long considered the West little more than a liability, now would see in Majorian a true partner, not a puppet, not a desperate claimant like Julius Nepos, but a real emperor in the tradition of the Caesars like in the good old days. The East would respect Majorian's strength, gaining legitimacy by it. But Majorian was not only a soldier, he was also a politician and, above all, a man of vision. He understood that Rome would never again be truly safe if East and West were divided by jealousy and mistrust, especially in the long run. He would then seek to bind them together, not just in war, but in family once again. Thus, Majorian would propose an alliance sealed by marriage to take a noblewoman from the Eastern court as his wife. Such a union would symbolize to the world that there were not two Romes, but one civilization, one people, one destiny, even if politically managed separately. For Majorian, this would mean more than diplomacy, it would mean legitimacy and respect in the eyes of the Eastern aristocracy, who would now see him not only as the savior of the West, but as a man tied by blood to Constantinople too, assuring therefore a legacy, for through this marriage children would be born, who would represent the heirs of both Romes, carrying the united blood of East and West into the future from now on, thanks to Majorian's effort. Majorian would have secured not only his reign, but also the continuity of the Western Empire itself. With all his successful reconquests and military feats, and now after the bond of the two halves of the Roman world being closer than they had been before his reign, this would have been the hope everyone would have been waiting for, and the confirmation that yes, Western Rome might have a chance to keep going for a little longer if managed correctly. With all of this accomplished, Majorian would now turn his gaze back to the heart of the West, Rome itself. For too long, the Eternal City would have been neglected, humiliated, treated as little more than a relic, especially after the sack of the Visigoths in 410. Majorian understood the power of symbols and would have known that Rome was more than a city, it was the heart of a civilization, and to restore Rome as the capital of the West would be to declare to the world that the empire was still alive. And so, Majorian would return to the West, entering Rome as a hero and a restorer. He would be hailed by the Senate and the people as the emperor who would have brought back North Africa, defended Gaul, and crushed the traitor of Ricimer. But Majorian would not be content with triumphal speeches or empty parades. He would have come back to Rome to impose laws, with reforms, and with a clear vision to rebuild Roman society from the ground up. In our timeline, even in his brief reign, Majorian had already issued decrees against corruption, against the exploitation of the poor, and against the destruction of Rome's ancient monuments. In this alternate timeline, he would have decades to enforce them. Governors would be held accountable, tax systems reformed to end the oppression of small farmers, and aristocrats reminded that their duty was not to themselves, but to the state. Most importantly, Majorian would address the greatest weakness of the late West, its army. No longer would Rome rely on foederati, those unreliable federate tribes that were really just a nuisance and an insurance policy towards failure for Rome. No longer would mercenaries be the sword and shield of the empire like it has been the case in the last century. Majorian would rebuild the legions as a Roman force, recruiting from Italy, Hispania, North Africa, and Gaul. Slowly but surely, year after year, a new generation of purely Roman soldiers would emerge, bound not by bribes, but by loyalty to the state and to the man who had kept his word of restoring stability to the Roman people. Within 2 or 3 decades, the West could realistically have fielded once again an army of 100,000 men, not the endless hosts of the past, but a force disciplined, united, and truly Roman, just like in the good old days of Roman legionaries of the Pax Romana. To make this possible, Majorian would revive an ancient principle that the nobility must serve, just as in the old republic, where the sons of patricians proved their worth on campaign, so too would the aristocracy of the 5th century be compelled to send their sons into the army, making it so that being a Roman noble was not simply about enjoying privilege, but about bearing responsibility and fighting for Rome. This would restore pride, duty, and the martial vigor of the ruling class, lost for generations. But Majorian's reforms would not end with the army. He would also seek to strengthen the people themselves. Inspired by Trajan's old Alimenta program, he would re-establish a system to provide grain and food security for the plebs of Italy and beyond, ensuring no Roman went hungry. With North Africa once again Rome's breadbasket, this policy would win him the undying loyalty of the masses, and to secure the future, he would introduce incentives for larger families, encouraging Romans to raise children who would one day march in the legions. By increasing the birth rate, he would not only give hope to the present, but also lay the foundation for future generations of citizens ready to defend their empire. Majorian would become not only a restorer of an empire, but also a restorer of identity, a man who reminded Romans of who they were, heirs of the greatest empire the world has ever seen. A people bound by duty, culture, and pride, not by fear or bribes, but by a shared belief in Rome as the culture that defined their own core identity. With every reform, every law, and every decree, Majorian would forge a new social contract between emperor and people. He would have given them victory, food, land, and justice. They, in turn, would give him loyalty, service, and faith, and for the first time in a century, the Western Empire would no longer merely survive, it would actually breathe and even begin to thrive once again, even if in a reduced state. But Majorian's vision of Rome would not only be forged on the battlefield or in the courts of law, but also in the realm of faith, for he understood better than most at the time that religion was sadly power, and in the wrong hands, it could become a rival to the state itself. By the 5th century, Christianity was the official faith of the empire, and paganism had been driven to the margins, and yet Majorian knew that Rome's greatness was not born from division, but from synthesis. He would never tolerate oppression in the name of zealotry. To him, the heritage of Rome was a living tapestry, woven from both the pagan traditions of the ancestors and the Christian faith of his own age, and one could not erase the other without tearing apart the unity of the whole. Thus, in this alternate timeline, Majorian would adopt a stance of tolerance. Christians and pagans alike would be allowed to live in peace, provided they respected the laws of the empire. Pagan temples would be preserved as part of Rome's cultural identity, just as churches would be honored. The state religion would remain Christianity, yes, but never as an excuse for persecution. At the same time, Majorian would be careful to prevent Christianity from becoming an independent political power. He would look to the east for guidance, where emperors in Constantinople practiced what we might call Caesaropapism, the principle that the emperor himself was the supreme arbiter of religious affairs. The bishops might advise, the clergy might teach, but ultimate authority would belong to the throne. This meant that the Bishop of Rome, who in our timeline would rise to become the Pope, the sovereign of the Western Church, would never achieve such independence under Majorian's rule. The church would remain subordinate to the emperor, integrated into the machinery of the state, prevented from ever becoming a rival power that could corrupt or manipulate the people. In this way, Rome would be spared the centuries of struggle between papacy and empire that fractured the West in the Middle Ages. For Majorian, the emperor was not only the defender of borders, but also the guardian of harmony, and by balancing Christian faith with pagan memory, by maintaining tolerance while asserting authority, he would preserve Rome's soul as much as its body. He would remind his people that Rome was not merely a faith, but a culture, and its unity, both spiritual and political, should always rest in the hands of its people and in the hands of a capable and worthy emperor. And with that, Majorian would reign not for 5 short years, but for 3 full decades more. From 461 to 491, he would rule as a worthy, true emperor of the West. By the time of his death, at 71 years old, Majorian would have become a legend in his own lifetime. He would be remembered not as a desperate reformer who died betrayed like in our timeline, but as the savior of Rome, the new restorer of the world. Again, the emperor who reformed society and who preserved both the heritage of the ancestors and the faith of his own time. When the people of Rome would think of him in the future, they would not see just a ruler, they would see the embodiment of Roman resilience. A man who proved that even in the darkest times, the flame of the empire could still burn. At his death in 491, the Western Empire would not be the vast dominion of Trajan, nor the unstoppable force of Augustus. Sure, it would be smaller, reduced, surrounded by enemies, and yet it would be stable, not prosperous, but alive. Its borders secure at the Seine in Gaul, its North African breadbasket restored, its Danubian frontier defended, its heart once again beating in Rome. A Western Empire no longer on the edge of collapse, but prepared for the challenges of a new age. And perhaps most importantly, Majorian would leave behind more than conquests and laws. He would leave a dynasty. Through his marriage into Eastern nobility, his heirs would carry the blood of both Romes, tying together East and West in ways that no politician or general alone could achieve. His sons and grandsons would inherit not just a throne, but a legacy of service, reform, and identity. In our timeline, the West collapsed in 476, but in this alternate world, it would endure, not as the invincible giant of the past, certainly, but as a resilient state reborn from the ashes, guided by the hand of a single man who refused to surrender, more and more becoming some kind of Western Byzantine Empire, so to speak. Majorian would die in peace, honored by his people, respected by the East, and feared by his enemies. And history would remember him as one of the greatest emperor of the West, the man who turned despair into hope and who proved, against all odds, that Rome was not yet finished. And with that, I think this is a good moment to end this video. Thank you for watching the video until the end. I hope you enjoyed this alternate story of Majorian surviving. Also, I can't end this video without mentioning the excellent work done by History's Influence and Majorianus, who covered the same topic on their own channels respectively long before me, and therefore, I can't finish my own interpretation of that alternate scenario without mentioning them, and obviously, the link to their respective videos will be in the video description. Moreover, as you can imagine, this world in which the Western Roman Empire survives much longer than expected is a very interesting one, and gives much to talk about long after the death of Majorian himself, so if this video reaches 1,000 likes, I will make a second part to this glorious story of the Western Empire, refusing to simply leave the face of the history of our glorious civilization. Anyway, don't forget to subscribe, like the video, become a member of the channel in order to have early access to new videos, and comment on what you thought of it. Thank you to our newest member of the channel, Pani, shout out to you, and I deeply appreciate your support of my work and projects to come. And without anything else to say, see you next time.